These tribes, since it was so dry, would rely on trade from people farther up north and past the sub-Saharan desert. They would make camp and hunt animals with what they had in store. They usually used camels. That's a camel. Promise you it's a camel. And they usually traveled in small little groups, usually making up tents as they went. Due to the lack of water in sub-Saharan Africa, its peoples could not form complex civilizations such as people up north and in Europe. Instead, Africa's peoples separated into nomadic tribes that would set up camp and eat animals, such as these cows. Often rely on traders from further up north to come down, and it, with its supply of gold and other various materials, would be able to trade for important things such as salt and water, which it firmly needed. Now, some African tribes were able to use what little water they had to make irrigation in a small little farmland. But they relied on getting not only salt and water from the further up tribes, but also the further up tribes were able to give them the vegetables and crops that they needed in order to feed cattle and keep themselves sustained. However, it's not as easy. Now, yes, this may look like a mountain range, but it's symbolic to show the very tough barrier to get across the Saharan desert. However, because these peoples they were nomadic and they didn't have as advanced technology as people further up north in Europe, they relied on people to come towards them. Well, these people that came towards them would come up further from north, and these people would have a plethora of crops. They would come by horse, usually offering, as expected with the dry Saharan desert. The soil was not only dry, but it was also very poor, not very rich in nutrients, so in general, agriculture, even if they had the water, would not be the smartest thing to do. In order for its cost and time and work, they resorted to mines and different other materials, while also hunting animals and setting up nomadic tribes. They had a farm here and there, but usually that would be in order to sustain themselves, in order to hunt other people. So the African tribes within this time period and how they acted really reminds me of the Central American civilizations at that time. The Central American civilizations at that time, although rich in water and nutrients, weren't very big on trade, and they usually didn't form humongous agriculture. This is with the exception, obviously, of the Mayan, Incan, and Aztecs, which did succeed enormously from agriculture. However, African tribes, due to their lack of agricultural progress, didn't really show very much advancement within that field. Now, yes, they showed advancement with different cultures and diverse ways of life, but I really felt after looking into this that the African tribes really would have benefited more if they had come together. However, there was many years of warring between the tribes, simply because they just hadn't figured it out. I mean, they had different cultures, different religions, different beliefs, and eventually they got, together and stuff. But that's still a problem today. I mean, you still have, warring countries in Africa. So the whole reason, this is all why tribes in Africa traded for salt and water instead of just growing plants, because they didn't have a really substantial water cycle. Now 3.3 doesn't give a lot on sub-Saharan Africa. However, I can tell you surely that the reason why there was no agricultural advancement within sub-Saharan Africa was purely because of the lack of agriculture. I mean, it's simply that. The tribes were all separated, very small, nomadic tribes, moved in like herds and stuff. They hunted animals, but they didn't, they didn't have enough resources per se to start agriculture. Once they found gold and, once they found gold and salt, they were able to trade with other places farther up north to allow themselves to sustain not only themselves, but allow themselves to advance their civilization and become more complex. However, just to blandly state it, I mean, Africa just doesn't have as many resources as, Europe did and everything. I mean, yes, it had metals and yes, it had, rocks and whatnot, but in terms of, plant life, which leads to animal life, they just didn't have a lot of it. Yeah, I mean, now you think of safari and you do think of plants, but however, like this demonstration shown, you have this, nomadic tribe staying here between this giant barrier. Sorry, my thumb. You have this nomadic tribe staying here between this giant barrier, and you have, all their materials. And I mean, they did collect materials, nevertheless, and they hunted animals too. That's not horses. We're gonna pretend that's cows. That's a fire, if you're wondering. You got people sleeping, and yeah, they usually practice culture. That's not African culture, but representation of African culture. Also, African culture isn't a whole thing. I mean, that's the representation of that tribe's culture, should I say? And these traders from the north in Europe had humongous farms up back at their home, and they would come down to Africa mainly for the reason of gold, because who doesn't love a little bit of gold? And on their way, they'd set up little camps, and they'd kind of become nomadic tribes for a split second while they're traveling over to Africa to trade. And that was the problem with the sub-Saharan, desert, is it wasn't surrounded by water at all. I mean, obviously I'd said that it didn't have that much water to begin with, but, I mean, this was in the middle of the desert. It's very hard to get to, and yes, symbolic again of a desert, but it's very, very hard to get to. Of the desert. It's very hard to get to, and yes, symbolic again of a desert, but it's very, very hard to get to. Very hard to, stay. So that's why they had camels. It's obviously a camel. That's also a camel. And yeah, they had a whole bunch of different specialists in order to, bring their water and their nutrients and their goods all to Africa to trade for gold. Yeah.